Read my shirt. When I have a little money, I buy books. And if I have any left, I buy food and clothes. Mm-hmm. That is the truth. Hi, my name is John. I'm a bibliophile. Now, I know what you're thinking. That doesn't mean I have bought every single book that I have on my shelves. Some of them were given to me, and one of them in particular, one of the few books that was actually a gift to me by my grandmother. And it is an oldie, but a goodie, one which I would highly recommend to anybody. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Now, yes, very old, because this book was originally published in 1873. Think about that for a minute. 1873. That's over 100 years before I was even born. And yet, it's still, to this day, is still one of my most treasured books. Not only because it was a gift to me by my grandmother, but because it's one of the older, the classic literature that I have read and thoroughly enjoyed. Now, the reason why I picked it up, the reason why I read it in the first place was because I had to do a book report way back when I was in high school. And the book report had to be on some piece of literature. You had to read a book and then write a report about it, what you thought of it, blah, 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 etc., etc. Wonderful little English thing. Anyone who's in high school probably knows about it. I certainly hope they're still doing book reports and still forcing you kids to read out there, but maybe not. I don't know. Still, it is a wonderful book about a man named Phileas Fogg who sets out to prove that he can circumnavigate the entirety of the globe in only 80 days. Now, back when this was put out, there were steamships, there were dirigibles, I believe steam locomotives at the time, but that was about the height of it. There wasn't really a lot of high-end technology, a lot of really fast travel. This is the sort of claim around the world in 80 days. Back in that day and age, that was nearly impossible. And Jules Verne is one of the biggest names in science fiction. He wrote, of course, Around the World in 80 Days. He also wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea with Captain Nemo. I think he also wrote Journey to the Center of the Earth, but I'm not 100% sure on that. It's been a long weekend for me, and I'm a little tired, so I'm not sure. But still, it's a wonderful little book. It's not that thick, really. There's only about boom, 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 about 37 chapters to it, and each chapter is only a handful of pages long. But there are also, at least in my version, I have the Reader's Digest edition that was put out, have these wonderful, wonderful drawings, as you can see, illustrations by, there's an artist name, or not, maybe, probably written down in the book somewhere. But yes, wonderful little illustrations in the one that I have, full color, gorgeous little things. But it is about a man named Phileas Fogg, and it is about his new servant, a Frenchman named Jean Passepartout. I'm probably mispronouncing that. And he gets on with Phileas Fogg. He becomes his servant in pretty much the very first chapter. And shortly thereafter, Phileas Fogg has his little argument, debate at the gentleman's club that he goes to, and he makes the claim that it could be done. Circumnavigate the entire globe in 80 days. He knows it can be done. And so the people at the Reform, this club that he goes to, tell him to basically put his money where his mouth is. Do it. Show us it can be done. So he agrees and immediately sets off to do it, dragging his poor, helpless servant around with him. Along the way, he runs into a lot of strange and interesting people and characters. There is a London policeman who starts following him because he is suspicious about the man and believes he's involved in criminal activity and thinks he's running to get away from the law. He meets a woman along the way and falls in love. He develops almost a comrade in arms mentality and relationship with his servant over the course of this 80-day adventure. And there's a lot of amazing locales, wonderful descriptions, wonderful writing. But it was written in 1873. Compared to writing these days, the writing is a little bit more archaic. It deals with some terms that you may have to look up, but that's what the internet is for. I mean, they talk about a game called Whist, WHIST, in this, and it, I believe, is a British card game, possibly. Not sure. But yeah, there's things, turns of phrase and whatnot that you may have to pop on your Google, have a little look through like the Urban Dictionary or something. Look on Wikipedia; it might have something written down there on there. But there's explanations for that out there if people are really wanting to know a story. And really, if you're reading a story and you don't understand it, and there's not an index in the book, and yes, there are actually books out there that have indexes and appendices in the back of it that you have to reference to get the most out of the book. One of my friends was telling me about a book called Dune, which I have yet to read by Dave Herbert, something Herbert, um, and it's got several appendices in the back. And he told me if I want to get the most out of this book when I do read it, it's sitting on my shelf now on my to-do list in my queue, to borrow a Netflix term or a British term, either way. Yeah, if I want to get the most out of it, he told me go read the appendices first, then bookmark it, then start reading the actual book and refer back as needed. And that just blew my mind a little bit because you've got a book that needs a reference guide to go with it. Insanely complex, a little bit daunting. It's not the sort of book I would recommend um, to a new reader. That's more for the seasoned readers, the hardcore readers. This doesn't really have a reference guide to it, but like I said, there are some terms of phrase, some things that you may want to reference, you may want to look up and whatnot, just to kind of get an idea of what's going on. Uh, Now, Jules Verne, British, uh, definitely a a writer, or maybe he's not British, maybe he's French. Hard to say, but definitely some older school writing, some old English writing going on here. Still, I would recommend the book, not just for the amazing journey, the amazing writing, but it's a look back at an older time, a time when writing was significantly different than it is now. A lot of writing these days is it's aimed at a different audience, a different mindset. I mean, just my generation and the generation I've seen growing up in the last 20 years or so is intensely strange intensely different than my parents' generation. So the writing is being aimed at a lot of those people. And this was aimed at a century ago, over a century ago, in fact, probably 125 years ago at least. This is what this was aimed at. And that's almost unfathomable back then. I can't wrap my head around that sort of person, that sort of mindset that Jules Verne would be writing for. And while this is kind of an adventure-y type thing, almost in the similar vein to the stories of um, John Quartermain and that type of high adventure, in a way, it's also kind of almost a travelogue as well of cultures and places. So, yeah, it is a wonderful story. It is a wonderful look at a time that you've never lived in, a time that you may not even be able to imagine. But it will help paint that picture. It will help fill in the gaps of your mind. And really, when it comes to anyone who's reading, they should look into reading at least one old book. At least one, if not more than one. Look into something 20, 30, 40 years old. Look into something 100 years old. Look into something older if you want to. Go back over 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Read the Iliad and the Odyssey. Read the Edda. Is some poetry. There's translated versions out there of that for both of them. But read something old. Read something from another time. What may as well be another world, given how far away it is in time from us nowadays. So yeah, it's probably going to be a little short, but this week I recommend Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. And I will leave you, my good friends, with this. Chapter 1, in which Phileas Fogg and Passepartout accept each other, the one as master, the other as man. Mr. Phileas Fogg lived in 1872 at number 7 Savile Row, Burlington Gardens, the house in which Sheridan died in 1814. He was one of the most noticeable members of the Reform Club, though he seemed always to avoid attracting attention, an enigmatical personage about whom little was known, except that he was a polished man of the world. People said that he resembled Byron, at least that his head was Byronic. But he was a bearded, tranquil Byron, who might live on 1,000 years without growing old. Certainly an Englishman, it was more doubtful whether Phileas Fogg was a Londoner. He was never seen on the Change, nor at the bank, nor in the counting rooms of the City. No ships ever came into London docks, of which he was the owner. He had no public employment. He had never been entered at any of the Inns of Court, either at the Temple, or Lincoln's Inn, or Gray's Inn. Nor had his voice ever resounded in the Court of Chancery, or in the Exchequer, or the Queen's Bench, or the ecclesiastical courts. He certainly was not a manufacturer, nor was he a merchant or a gentleman farmer. His name was strange to the scientific and learned societies, and he never was known to take part in the sage deliberations of the Royal Institution or the London Institution, the Artisans' Association, or the Institution of Arts and Sciences. He belonged, in fact, to none of the numerous societies which swarm the English capital, from the Harmonic to that of the entomologists, founded mainly for the purpose of abolishing pernicious insects. Phileas Fogg was a member of the Reform, and that was all. The way in which he got admission to this exclusive club was simple enough. He was recommended by the Barings, with whom he had an open credit. His checks were regularly paid at sight from his account current. which was always flush. Was Phileas Fogg rich? Undoubtedly. But those who knew him best could not imagine how he had made his fortune, and Mr. Fogg was the last person to whom to apply for the information. He was not lavish, nor, on the contrary, avaricious, for whenever he knew that money was needed for a noble, useful, or benevolent purpose, he supplied it quietly and sometimes anonymously. He was, in short, the least communicative of men. He talked very little, and seemed all the more mysterious for his taciturn manner. His daily habits were quite open to observation, but whatever he did was so exactly the same thing that he had always done before, that the wits of the curious were fairly puzzled. Had he travelled? It was likely, for no one seemed to know the world more familiarly. There was no spot so secluded that he did not appear to have an intimate acquaintance with it. He often corrected, with a few clear words, the thousand conjectures advanced by members of the club as to lost and unheard of travellers, pointing out the true probabilities, and seemingly as if gifted with a sort of second sight, so often did events justify his predictions. He must have travelled everywhere, at least in the spirit. It was at least certain that Phileas Fogg had not absented himself from London for many years, for those who were honoured by a better acquaintance with him than the rest declared that nobody could pretend to have ever seen him anywhere else. His sole pastimes were reading the papers and playing whist. He often won at this game, which, as a silent one, harmonized with his nature. But his winnings never went into his purse, being reserved as a fund for his charities. Mr. Fogg played, not to win, but for the sake of playing. The game was in his eyes a contest, a struggle with a difficulty, yet a motionless, unweary struggle, congenial to his tastes. Until next time, remember, you should be reading.